السلام ورحمة الله وبركاته. It's not bad يا شيخ. I think it's good, right? طيب. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين وصلى وسلم على سيدنا محمد وعلى آله وأصحابه أجمعين ومن تبعهم بإحسان إلى يوم الدين أما بعد. Welcome to another session of our Friday night, inshallah. Now the topic of tonight was particularly picked due to the circumstances and things that have been happening in the past few days in various universities and various protests in different areas. Just to give you a recap and just an understanding of what has been happening. So thousands of students across the states and also in different countries, but particularly I'm going to talk about the states. They have been participating in what's considered an encampment or a sit-in, right? So essentially they stay on campus and they camp out in almost over 100 colleges, including some of the big colleges, whether it's Rutgers universities or University of Columbia and so forth, UCLA, various big universities that's been happening across. And the protests are framed essentially as an act of solidarity with more, for support of the our Palestinian brothers and sisters, due to the fact that until this day, there's over 34,500 deaths that have happened since October 7th of last year. Unfortunately, about 70% of those deaths are women and children, right? Which tells you that there is a indiscriminatory methodology of, perhaps we can call it execution or indiscriminatory killing that's happening. And so this is a form of solidarity, forming a solid protest or a solid support system to voice our support towards them. Now the students are doing this to demand that their voices are to be heard by the university governing bodies mainly, as well as try to cause a bit of a social and political change. The injustice that's been happening to our brothers and sisters in Palestine, and as an objection to the way how universities were reacting, but also including the governments, how they're dealing with this injustice. Now, there are several demands that have been made by these brave students. May Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala protect them. And by the way, the majority of them, yes, are Muslims, but it's not just Muslims, but many people, including practicing Jews, have joined them. Obviously, people from different walks of life, ideologies have joined them because they realize the injustice that has been happening and the fact that it's ethnic cleansing, that it's really what's occurring at the moment. Now, the demands that they're asking, just to clarify what they're asking and why they're asking for this, and I'm going to get back, inshallah, how this is a form of activism. And so there are based on the different campuses, they have different demands. But the main demands include one, what's called a divestment, right? I think the older generation will understand what divestment is, but I don't think the younger ones know what divestment is. Do you know what a divestment is? What is it? So divestment, essentially, all it means is just divest, which means diverge, to move whatever financial aspects you're doing to something else. And essentially, in a nutshell, that's what it is, right? So the students are calling for the universities to divest all their finances from companies that are, or institutions that support directly or indirectly the Israeli apartheid that is occurring. And the occupation, whether it helps and supports in terms of materials, directly or indirectly, with the occupation of Palestine, or one way or another support Israel. Okay, so this is what it's doing, and this would include things such as selling off investments from Israeli companies, and those that with ties to Israel or endowments to those companies to kind of divert them to other places and so forth. Now, why is this? Why are they making this demand? Because about 100 colleges, approximately, or universities, have reported about gifts or contracts from Israel totaling approximately about over $350 million, right, over the past 2 decades. This is not including, now these are just like, gifts and contracts. Does not include the money invested in companies that are associated with, directly or indirectly, with support to Israel. And this, by the way, this is according to the Department of Education database. Now, the question is, though, has this historically worked before? Right? Has this historically worked? Like this process of the students voicing their opinion, why, like, they're doing this because obviously they feel that the the methodology of that's been used is not effective, and so they're resorting to other means. But historically, has this worked or not? The answer is yes. Right? Historically, this did work, and it was through the will and motivation and empowerment of many of the youth in previous history that resulted in universities divesting their investments from things that were considered, that the college students considered something that is inappropriate, right, or injustice. Such as, for example, the divestment led by them that campaigns over, the South African apartheid, right, rule in the 1980s. Right, so that's not far in history, at least not for me. I don't feel it's far. It pressured Columbia University to to withdraw its investments from companies operating in the country. Now, by about approximately, I think, 1988, a total of 155 colleges had at least partially divested from South Africa, with 5 institutions fully divesting. Right, so it does have an effect. Other institutions, such as Stanford University, for example, chose to divest from Sudan in 2005 because of what has been happening there, whatever the political situation or oppression they feel is happening. But this happened in 2005. In more recent times, more than 140 higher education institutions have divested from fossil fuels since 2011 due to pressure from the students and faculty members. In 2015, schools pulled out investment from private prisons, right, due to some of the inhumane treatments. Columbia University being the first university to do it in 2015. Now, until the moment, perhaps, as far as I know, from what I try to look through the news, many universities still have not responded to that pressure, except perhaps Brown University seems to be the only college considering the divestment in response to the pressure that has been happening, which tells you something is happening and it is working. Now, their second demand is what they call End the Silence, which they're calling for the universities to release public statements calling for immediate and permanent ceasefire in Gaza, denouncing the ongoing genocidal campaigns against the Palestinian people, and call on government officials to do the same. Right, so there's the second demand. And the third one is more of the academic level, but it's an academic boycott. Right, there are certain relations between universities in Tel Aviv universities and so forth, exchange of programs or dual degree programs or fellowships or research collaborations. They're asking for all that to cease. So basically, that's what they're doing. Now, obviously, this does not come without sacrifice. This is understood. It does not come without sacrifice. And that sacrifice includes the protesters putting their own bodies in harm, right, under potential, for example, threat of arrest or risk of their educational careers or work careers if they're older, and so forth. It comes with a sacrifice that they understand and they're willing to give. May Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala reward them, because this is what sometimes requires for change to happen, right? Now, the reality is, I think, wallahu a'lam, we are living a historical moment. Like, this is an important part of history, and I ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to enable us to navigate it in the best way possible. When all efforts of diplomacy at a government level and in institutions like our universities and colleges have all failed, and Palestinians are continuing to suffer unprecedented oppression and destruction, this student movement has spearheaded, right, a new strategy to try to force change, right, through public awareness and, trying to create a media, coverage as much as possible. But obviously, unfortunately, some of the media is not fair and portray things that are not true. But they're trying their best, and this is the, almost, subhanAllah, the most important, or the, let me rephrase it this way. This is the most impactful result we've seen so far since the beginning of the October 7th events, right? Now, the primary impact of these activities lies really in gradually shifting the public opinion and fostering discourse that is independent of the control of, that is exerted usually by media outlets, right? Whether they're bankrupted politicians, and the media outlets that are extremely biased, right? Because there are obviously other agendas, and they get their financial support from other places. Now, that being said, we have to remember that on this journey, right, we are bound by the boundaries of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala that He placed for us. So anything that we do, right, has to be within that framework, as Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala placed that framework for a reason, because it's meant to protect us, but also to bring out the best outcome in this world and hereafter. Now, having that in mind, this is why it is important for us to understand or talk about Islamic activism, its importance and guidelines, okay? So this is a long-winded introduction. You okay with that? I just wanted to give you like a bit of a background why we're talking about this and why we're going to touch on Islamic activism. But Islamic activism, really, it's a bit more general than what is happening. But I'm going to use this as a model, inshallah, as a base that we can use to bring about other things, okay? So, just a warning, I'll be asking questions to make sure you're paying attention, including the 3 or 4 girls on their cell phones at the back. So pay attention. I'll be putting you on spot and asking you questions, all right? You know, the only reason you got my attention is because you guys are just shifting in your seats back and forth, and it just catches my peripheral vision. I apologize. And you're you're just looking at each other's phones, and alhamdulillah. Where are your parents? So I'm using this as an excuse just to drink something warm. Type. Let's start with what is activism. What does that term mean? What's activism? What is activism? The one in red. Yeah, you're the only one I see in red. What is activism? What's your name? I can't hear you. Somebody send a mic there, please. What's your name? You know, it's kind of hard when you hand your hand in front of your mouth. Inaya? It is Inaya? Huh? Hidayah. All right, Hidayah. What is activism? Ask your neighbor. It's to do exercise, right? To be active, right? To run around in circles. All right, supporting something. It's a good start. Okay, so I want you to pay attention to what the activism is. So activism, what really it is, it consists of efforts of different types, right? It can be any kind of effort, but the whole purpose of that effort is to promote or impede, right? Promote or impede, which means to prevent, or direct or intervene in either social, political, economical, or environmental reforms. So essentially the whole point of activism is to bring about reform, right? Change, right? Once again, whether it's at the economical scene, political, social, or, what's the last one I mentioned? Environmental, right? Environmental. To make changes in society towards a perceived greater good. Okay, so for example, if there's injustice, you move to remove it, right? If there is immoral things that happening in society, for example, you move or you do things to kind of promote its change, right? That's the whole objective to it. And activism often comes about as a way to pursue social change or social injustice, right? To advocate for an idea, right? To advocate for a cause, whether it's human rights or moral values, okay? So having that in mind, the question is then, is there a difference between, because I called it Islamic activism, and of course, obviously going to say there's a difference, but I'm going to ask, what is the difference? Is there a difference between Islamic activism and secular activism? Right? Of course you're going to say yes, because that's why I'm bringing this up. But what is the difference? All right, so one is based on the Islamic framework, the teachings of the Prophet ﷺ, teachings of the Quran. But what about the secular one? What's it based on? So then there's okay, so the difference is the belief system, right? That is actually very close. The secular activism is really what it's based on, is based on the cultural norms of justice. Okay, the cultural norms of justice, morality, and human rights. As they're determined by any sort of group. Okay. Now, what this does, it makes values subjective. Because if we're talking about human rights, moral values, what is justice, and it's based on what a group of people believe, right? Essentially, this is the secular, it was based on, then it tells you that these values are subjective. And they will continue to change. All right? That's the difference between the secular and the Islamic activism. Because unlike the secular kind of philosophy, as Muslims, we understand that justice, morality, and human rights are determined by our mothers, right? Did you say yes? No, who's it determined by? Okay, this is a very sleepy crowd. You actually do need chai before the class. Huh? I can't hear you. Cultural norms. In Islam? No. In secular, but I'm talking about in Islam. Yes. Based on the teachings of who? Yes, but so that comes from who? Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, right? So whether what we perceive as justice or what is human rights or morality, it's not based on our opinion as a group of people. It is based on what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala determines. And that's really important, because what that does, it no longer becomes, for us, it no longer becomes subjective, it becomes objective. Right? Objective means we have no control over it. It's not based on our biases or desires. This is something Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has already established for us. And so when we as Muslims call for justice, or we fight against immorality, or call for human rights, it is all based on our Islamic framework, right? That was given to us by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and has been taught to us by the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, right? And practiced by the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. And so for Muslims, activism is tightly connected to our objective values, and it is part of our Islamic teachings. The Prophet, I'll give you an example, right? The Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam said, "من رأى منكم منكرا فليغيره بيده فإن لم يستطع فبلسانه فإن لم يستطع فبقلبه." Right? So I'm trying to show you that this activism is connected to our Islamic teachings. So the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, he said, "Whomever of you sees evil, then they must change it with their hand. If they can't, then with their tongue, which means speak against it. And if they can't, then with their hearts. And that is the weakest, right, of Iman. That is the slightest effect of Iman. That's it." So what this hadith really points out, right? So when the Prophet ﷺ says, "Whomever of you sees evil," right? The understanding is, sees evil as determined by Allah, not by us. Right? Determined by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And this is when we realize that we have to change it. Otherwise, we have no business of meddling with it. Right? Another hadith that shows you the importance of this whole idea of Islamic activism and how it's connected to our religion is an interesting hadith that the Prophet ﷺ, it's a parable, right? An example the Prophet ﷺ gave. And he said that the example of the one, or the parable, right, of the one who respects the limits of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and those who violate them. Because Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has given an example or a parable of those who respect that limit, like the boundaries of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and those that violate and cross that boundary is the example of a group of people on board a ship. Okay? And so they drew among themselves who's going to be on the top deck and who's going to be in the lower deck. All right? And so they made a drew, and whoever ended up at the upper deck ended in the upper deck, whoever ended in the lower deck ended at the lower deck. Now, when those who are in the lower deck wanted to get water, they would have to go to the upper deck and get the water. So the lower people at the lower deck had an idea. They said, listen, we're disturbing the people in the upper deck a lot. Like, we keep going up there, we're causing problems. So let us just puncture a hole, right, in the bottom deck, so that we will be able to get to the water that we need. So obviously this boat is not in salty water, it's in fresh water, right? So you can just, somebody asked can they drink salty water? No, obviously this is an example of where they are in fresh water, in rivers, whatever the case is. And so they said, let's do that so we can get the water and not harm the people above us. Okay? Now, right, so the Prophet ﷺ said, if those in the upper deck, right, let them, the lower deck, do whatever they want, then they will all be destroyed together. If the people do not stop them, they will all fall and be failure. But if they stop them, they will all be saved. Okay, so this is the example. So what this is pointing to is that this hadith is calling us to, there's several messages. Right? Among the messages that are there is that we need to provide, if there is a problem and an issue. So obviously in this example, there's an issue. The people at the lower deck, they want water, right? And so they're looking for a solution. They're kind of tired going up and down. They feel like they're bothering the top deck. And so we need some sort of a solution. And so what this hadith is telling us is that we need to provide legitimate solutions to legitimate problems, or else people will resort to illegitimate ways or methodologies that will harm the entire group, one way or another, okay? Or the ummah or the society as a whole. And so the example of this is the lower deck individuals. They wanted to puncture a hole, right? Good intentions, mashallah, beautiful intentions, right? We don't want to harm our brothers and sisters up there. But in the end result, is this the smartest thing to do? Is it the smartest thing to do? No, right? You guys know what happens if you puncture a hole, right? I'm just checking if you guys are asleep or awake. What happens? Oh, mashallah, you guys move the front. Some of you. Some are still in the back. Tight. So, from an ideological perspective, that doesn't mean that there is no place for example, discussing ideas or ideologies or engaging in rigorous intellectual discourse. But this goes hand into hand of what we need to do within that framework of Islamic understanding. Okay? So, I'm just going to put a note over here, just a side note, right? And I'm putting this for a reason, is because, and I kind of mentioned this in a couple of other lectures before, but I'm just going to rephrase it in a different way, is that we need to push back. When we talk about solutions, finding solutions to problems that we have, we need to push back on the idea that all good ideas originated from the West. Right? That's far away from what the truth is. In reality, much of what actually benefits us actually comes and originates from Islamic teachings. Right? And if we just, get ourselves to look first in our religion, and then if we don't find it, we look at somewhere else, we will be in a better position, right? And I mentioned a line of poetry, I think it was last week, where the person said, kali'iru, right? Like the camel walking in the desert, dying out of thirst, and it's carrying its water. Like it's carrying water on it, right? And so we should not be like that. We have our solutions with us. We carry the book of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. We carry the teachings of our beloved Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. We should not be dying out of thirst, right? It is there for us. We need to just take from it. Wallahu alam. All right, now, that being said, when we talk about this whole aspect of activism, naturally, if we don't promote our own framework, our framework of what we see is right or moral or justice or human rights, we risk reinforcing frameworks that are being imposed upon us or that are given to us that are foreign, right, to our own teachings and beliefs. And so they can principally be extracted, they can be, take us away from our faith or affect our religious practice one way or another, right? So, to understand the importance of Islamic activism, right, we can simply ask the question, right? To point out, So all this is just about what activism, its connection to our religion and so forth. But to show you how important really it is to have Islamic activism, we can ask a simple question. What will happen if we do not take an active role in directing the narrative of what is going on around us? Right? What would happen if we just become bystanders? This is a question to you, right? So this is the simplest way to understand, should we have Islamic activism or not? Like I connected it already to religion. Activism is part of our religion. It's part of, forbidding what is evil and ordaining what is good. The Prophet ﷺ had taught us. And we talked about the parable of the people on the ship. So this is a society, right? People on the upper deck, people on the lower deck. If we don't talk to one another, we will all drown, right? If we don't fix things, we will all drown. And so it is connected to our teachings. But the question is, how important is it? So the way I'm asking this is, what would happen if we do not take control of the narrative and directing the narrative of what is happening around us? There will be no change in our society, right? Nothing stays constant, ya Sheikh. There will be change. There will be change. But what kind of change? Yes. The narrative will be written for us, essentially, right? Whether so even the language, right? The language of the narrative, right? So the narrative of the moral code, the moral values, the justice, human rights, all that language will be given to us. We will have no control over this, right? And it will be held or communicated or dealt with without regards to our own beliefs or values, right? And we don't have to go very far. This is what has been happening because we have not, as Muslims, been as active as we should, right? In terms of engaging in Islamic activism. All of a sudden, we're taken by surprise by legislations that dictate or place into laws moral things that force us to do things that are against our religion, for example, right? Or to agree to them. Now, what else would happen? Yes. People start to disrespect us. Not necessarily disrespect, right? But essentially, I'm going to rephrase that. We tend to end up losing, right? Things that would be considered our constitutional rights. So no one will advocate for our rights. If we don't advocate for our own rights, who will? Why should they? Right? If we don't help ourselves, why should others help us? Essentially. I should rephrase this. Us voicing or advocating for our own rights is constitution, our own values. This is part of our constitution, right? And if we don't do it, nobody's going to do it for us. So this is what also we would what we would lose. What else? What else would happen? Exactly, right? We will end up, we feel like we're going to have to compromise our moral values to make progress, right? But even worse, right? Sometimes we're going to start feeling a sense of helplessness and hopelessness, right? That we can't do anything because we just can't change things around us. What's interesting is that there is, in research-wise, that there is evidence that social and political activism actually leads to improved psychological wellness. Like it enhances a group of people's sense of control over their own lives that would allow them to combat helplessness and hopelessness, right? Because sometimes you say, what can I do, right? That's an expression of helplessness and hopelessness. No, there is something we can do, right? It is through engaging in this Islamic activism that would empower us to continue and not lose hope, right? To push further. That's why it's important. So I'm going to mention one thing of what would happen if we don't engage in Islamic activism, is that the world will continue to further lose its moral value and continue to become a worse place. Because once again, for them, this is all based on a group of people opinion of what is justice and what is not, what are moral values, and that's why they will continue to change. And we obviously see it's not changing to better necessarily, right? In many cases, there is improvement, but in more cases, there is, what's the opposite of improvement? Should I turn this into an English language class, Sheikh? Right? Like, things are getting worse, essentially, right? So we are the moral compass of this world, right? Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, because we carry the correct religion, the correct teachings. So we are the moral compass of this world, and we need to show others the way. If we don't, they will get lost. Okay, this is why it's important. طيب, how much do I have? So I'm going to try to finish at 9:15. I got yelled at last week. I apologize. Lost track of time. But we'll try inshallah to finish in 15 minutes. So things to note, right? When we're trying to engage in Islamic activism, right? I'm going to try to summarize about perhaps maybe 2 or 3 points, okay? 2 points. We'll talk about 2 points, okay? So one is when we're doing this, we need to realize that we need to take control of the language of the framework. We need to put the definitions, right? We cannot work within other people's definition of things because then we are working in their framework, right? We have to change that, right? Articulating those frameworks should be intentional as we do it in the spirit of reviving the teachings of the Prophet ﷺ, right? This is what the Prophet ﷺ brought to us, as opposed to trying to fit into, right, the terminology that is given to us, right? Which quite often does not encompass the profound sunnah and teachings of Islam, the profound sunnah of the Prophet ﷺ and the teachings of Islam. It doesn't, right? Now we see the opposite side constantly trying to change and redefine things. Simple example, right? The current attempt to redefine anti-Semitism. You guys know the law that's being passed by the Senate, right? Why are they doing this? Now, by the way, it has several implications, right? It tells you that what is happening on the political scene is causing change, right? The fact that the Senate is discussing something tells you that the view of the public is starting to change. And for the first time in many years, right, people are pushing back on the whole idea of free support with Israel, right? So this is resulting a pushback by trying to put legislations to redefine anti-Semitism to prevent people from doing certain things. Yes? No, they cannot ban protesting. Well, that's the whole part of changing, redefining what anti-Semitism is, right? That's why. So they're using that as an excuse now, right? To say, hey, listen, this is no longer free speech, it is hatred, right? This is why they're trying to redefine things, but we need to push back on stuff like that. It's important for us to kind of, when we're talking about what we're doing, the Islamic activism, is it really anti-Semitism? We have to define the framework of why we're doing something, right? And push back and take control of the narrative. Now, we should constantly think, we can constantly both think and act, right, in the framework of Islam as we're doing this. Now, when we are trying to craft a language, right, especially on sensitive issue, what we need to make sure is that the language that we're picking is authentic to our Islamic belief and paradigm. Like, we have to make sure so it doesn't drag us to something else. So once again, it puts us in the front seat and not somebody else. The language that we're picking, right, when we're crafting it, it should be consistent across the board, right? Because inconsistency causes problems. So we can't say, one thing in a Muslim space and another in a non-Muslim space, for example. This will cause contradictions. We can't do that. Now, unfortunately, in the past, this is what's been happening, right? In our Islamic space, we advocate, we talk about certain things, but outside, it's something else now, right? It's almost we bought into this whole secular model of, uh, your religion is in your house and your temple. It's not in the street, right? But that's not the case. As Muslims, you understand that's not the case. We have to be consistent in our behavior and what we talk about in Muslim spaces and outside of Muslim spaces. That's the only way we will gain true respect of others. There's nothing we should be afraid of, right? Especially if we frame things in the best way possible. In the end, once again, our teachings are the perfect teachings because they're from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. There's no deficiency in it, right? Now, the other thing is when we are crafting that language, we have to craft it in a way that is wise and beautiful, right? Because the beauty and the wisdom of the message should not betray the substance of the message or make it ambiguous. We have to be very careful not to be overly ambiguous, but also not to make it look in a way that it repels people or reject people from trying to understand or listen to our narrative, all right? All right, now, that being said, right, I'm going to get to the second part, which is when we're talking about Islamic activism, the second thing we have to do is when we're implementing it and practicing it, we have to work at various levels. Right? It can't just be one level, but we have to really hit multiple levels. Now, the first level, and I feel like the most important one, is the individual level. Right? The individual level is where we put pressure in the space where we are in. Okay? If we are in an area, right? If we ideate in a certain direction that's positive, right? Push it to consistency, right? So, I'm gonna give you an example, just to kind of drive my point through. One, you are in a liberal setting, for example. Okay, if you're in a real liberal setting where people identify as individuals who are enlightened, progressive, challenge them on the exclusion of Palestine. Right? Challenge them on the exclusion of Palestine. If they talk about, like for example, cages at borders, like they're like, you know, to talk about, look at the borders of Mexico, there's cages there, they put like, you know, immigrants in those cages. Ask them, why don't they talk about, like, you know, Guantanamo or Abu Ghraib, right? Why don't they talk about the largest air prison in the world, right? It's the same idea, but what you did over here is you're pushing for consistency, right? You're trying to figure out where the consistency is and use that for your benefit in your own space as an individual to direct the conversation and convince others, right, of our own, like, you know, objectives and goals and what we're trying to seek and achieve, right? The change we're trying to bring about. If they talk about policing, right, where are they on militarism, right? So, for example, if they say there's brutality in policing, whatever the case is, well, what about the military, that, like, you know, militarism that's happening in Gaza, right? So you draw parallels over here and point out inconsistencies. That's just an example of, as individuals, within our own space, how we can do this. Now, of course, this requires us to be very well-read and up-to-date and critical thinkers. Like, conversations like those have to be very tactful, right? Very intelligent. Now, I'll give you another example now of being in a conservative, right, area. So if you're in a conservative setting, challenge them on how they would uphold morality as sacred, yet overlook, right, regularly the frequent moral discretions of, like, you know, Republican political actors, including the president himself, right? Challenge them on their like, an insistence on the sanctity of the unborn that doesn't seem to translate to born black and brown babies or Muslims or other minorities, right? Them valuing the blood of, like, you know, the people here, but not the blood of all other human races, including our brothers and sisters in Palestine, right? So this is what I'm talking about at an individual, right? When talking about an individual setting. Now, the second level is at the Muslim community level, right? So this is activism at the Muslim community level, which is we need to create networks and groups with different task forces, okay? Activism can take different forms and shapes, right? Remember, it's an objective. You're trying to bring change, and that can come different ways, each based on our own expertise, right? We all have been given from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala specific skills and talents. This is where we utilize those talents and skills to direct them in different task forces to get a specific objective, right? Why not cover as much as bases as we can, essentially, right? People who are good at the economical level, right, work there. People who are involved in the political scene work there. There's the intellectual production, right? The intellectual thought, philosophies, arguments. There has to be a group of Muslims in that area, right? Educational, media level, right? Media is really important, right? It's what shapes the, the minds and views of generations. So we have Muslims who are talented in the media area, so there has to be some sort of a task force there, right? And so if you look at this, if we all utilize our skills, we can hit multiple things at the same time to order to drive our Islamic activism for our perspective to be reached to a larger population. Right? The last one I'm going to mention, which is also important to what we're seeing nowadays, is to form coalition and allies with other groups. Realistically speaking, we will be unable to achieve what we want without proper and correct coalitions and alliances. We need that. This is based on what the Prophet ﷺ did. And so the Prophet ﷺ said after Islam, he said, I witnessed a treaty at the home of Abdullah ibn Jad'an. Right? Abdullah ibn Jad'an, he said, I witnessed a treaty there. If I was asked to attend such a meeting now, I would answer it. Now, this treaty had happened before Islam, and it had to do with upholding the rights of the oppressed in Quraysh. Right? A group of people, there was a merchant that was oppressed, his rights were taken, and so a group of people from Quraysh did not like that, and so they came and formed a coalition and alliance to support the oppressed. And the Prophet ﷺ witnessed it, and he said, if I was to be asked to witness it again in Islam, I would do it, which means he would ally with the non-Muslims for an objective that aligns with our moral code and values. That's what it means, right? So this is where this comes from. And so the Prophet ﷺ mentioning mentioning that he would continue to uphold the pact indicates that it was still in place when the Prophet ﷺ said this statement, despite the fact that many of the original members of the agreement never accepted Islam. Right? We have to understand he's talking about even if they're non-Muslims, I will still have that pact and agreement with them and ally with them in that objective, because it is a moral one that coincides with our moral values and things that should be done and change in society. And so the Prophet ﷺ also made it clear that he wasn't abiding by it because he felt compelled to do so, but because it was noble before and after Islam. That's why. Right? Now, our participation as Muslims in allies like this or in coalitions will be very beneficial for us, especially for the young generations. The reason behind it is because if we engage in that, it'll allow our youth to frame their support, for example, in this case, to Palestine and other Muslim causes through appropriate lenses, because we're guiding them to do it, right? As Muslims, we're all doing this as Muslims, guiding their involvement and allowing them to connect better with their faith, because they find that their faith, right, upholds moral values that are deserving to chase behind. Right? The youth are all about change. Right? That's what they're about. When they see something wrong, they want to change it. And so, as a Muslim community, being involved in Islamic activism helps guide the youth, right, and mentor them to do it in the proper framework, so they would not be lost. It will help them better be rooted in their faith, right? And not think that their faith does not have the basis to uphold what is moral. طيب. Now, when we are doing these alliances, there are things that we must note and bear in mind while we're doing this. These are important, right? And so I'm talking about over here, why, the importance of it, and the guidelines. Here's the guideline part of forming the, within Islamic activism, alliances and coalition with others that are non-Muslim, for example. Okay. So this coalition or alliance, in essence, is a collaboration, right? We're collaborating on something, on a cause, on an objective that is usually temporary in nature, right? We have to understand this, that it's temporary in nature, and is based upon a narrow focus of an issue. Why I'm saying this? Because we have to understand that forming an alliance doesn't mean that we accept everything, right, that our ally brings, or that they should accept everything that we bring. No, we are uniting on a narrow issue, right? And it's something that is temporary. We're uniting on. Once the objective is achieved, that's it, right? We have to remember that, and that's really important, because otherwise, what would happen? Sometimes we feel compelled to support everything from the other side, even if it's against our religion. We have to be careful of that, right? So we have to be mindful when we're forming the alliance. It's in a narrow focus issue. Similar to the example of the Prophet ﷺ, right? He said that alliance he was talking about, that pact, was to uphold, right, to bring justice to the oppressed. It's something specific, even with a disbeliever. It's not supporting everything with a disbeliever. Yes? So are we supposed to support that in the first place? But that's why I'm saying this is important. So we are combining, like we are aligning with them in that narrow aspect only. That's it, right? Now, the polytheists, right, committed the worst sin, which is associated with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Yet, the Prophet ﷺ was still ready to have a coalition with them in that category only. Right? That's it. So I'm going to mention this now, right? Just to kind of, so I guess this is, I should have reiterated this, or maybe started with this. Coalition or allied partners do not have to share the same belief system and methodologies in order to cooperate upon limited common goals. Is that clear? Yes. I was very general. I said non-Muslims. So a non-Muslim is everything else, right? But once again, we have to be very careful. What are we allying on? That's it, okay? So I'm going to put it also, I'm going to add this other point, right? Because it will come up. Like, having an alliance or a coalition partner, right? An allied partner or coalition partner can be in partnership in some issues, right? While simultaneously be in opposition to other issues. That is the nature of alliances, right? Otherwise, we'd be the same group. We're not the same group. That's why we require the alliance, right? Now, when we're dealing with these alliances or coalitions, we should make sure that we realize that conditional allyship should be rejected. Okay? There is no rule of reciprocating things, right? That demands anyone to politically support an issue that contradicts their consciousness. So it should never be, I'll support you here so you can support me there. That is conditional. It does not work that way, right? We should not get into those kind of alliances. This is not how it should be, right? And so we should never be afraid to articulate our position in totality, right? We have to be very, we should completely be honest, right? And if someone doesn't want to work with us because of that, they're not worthy of our partnership. We don't need their support, right? This kind of answers the whole aspect of what if they have other faith, other beliefs, whether it's LGBT, whether it's atheism, whatever you put in there, right? They have to understand that this is for a purpose, and it does not indicate we're going to reciprocate it, because this happens a lot in college campuses, for example, right? So for example, the LGBT would stand with the Muslim MSAs to support them, for example, in some event, and then they request the MSA's support in an LGBT march, for example. No, right? It doesn't work that way. We're not going to do that because we disagree with this. We're not saying we can't do that. Now, if you want our support in something else that we agree with, we'll be there. But We should never ever join in a purpose that disagrees with our faith. So this is the alliance. Now, the reality is when we form alliances and partnerships and coalition with non-Muslims, and we are at an event together, right? During the event, right, we understand that we cannot control other people's behaviors. You have to understand this. We can't control it, but what we can control is our own behavior. We can control it as much as possible. And this is really important when the majority are Muslims. Like what's happening nowadays, like whether the encampment that's going on or the protests, they are led majority by Muslims, most of them. And we have to be very careful how we conduct ourselves, right? We have to have, control our own behavior as much as possible, right? And having a group of Muslims there around us will actually allow us to help one another maintain our Islamic code of conduct. This is really important because it would reflect, because the media is not going to look at the Jewish person or the Christian person or the Latino or the African American. They're not going to look at those. Whenever something negative happens, they're going to say what? The Muslims or the pro-Palestinians look at the violence, right? Or look at the corrupted moral behavior that they have, right? And so when we're in these events, we have to be very careful to conduct ourselves in the most Islamic way possible. Now, when we find ourselves in a situation where that a compromise is required, right? But this compromise in a particular situation is unbearable, right? Un-Islamic. We cannot, we cannot compromise in this area. We need to prioritize our religious commitment. It's okay to leave at that moment. For example, if these protests turn violent, right, like purposely destroying property, Muslims should never participate in that. Ever, for example, right? That goes against our moral code. We're there for a reason. We're practicing our constitutional right to protest and voice our opinion peacefully without damaging other people's property, because in our religion, it's haram to damage other people's property, right? So we draw those lines. We have to understand it is okay to leave, right? We should never compromise our religion and those allyship or coalitions. Like, I think this is I'm only 2 minutes over time. I'm so excited about this. Alhamdulillah. So I'm going to leave room for questions. And hopefully a few minutes if you want to go to the back. Now, I know we have chai. I hope you guys brought dessert. We're not bringing dessert. Just let you know. Dessert is on you guys, okay? So if there's no dessert, it's not our fault. We have the chai, all right? So, any questions? Yes, Sheikh. So individuals, what can we do as individuals to help out? So this is where I talked about the individual level, right, within your sphere. So it can start with as simple as making dua, right? The most important thing is make dua to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, right? But also, as an individual, you influence the circle that you're in by talking, right? Talking to others, convincing them of your your qadiyya, right? Your whatever you are calling to, convince them of it. Intellectually engaging in conversations with them. And then as an individual, based on your sphere of influence, what you can do. So for example, if you're a CEO of a company that has huge investments, that's a lot of control that you have of what you can do in terms of put pressure in certain ways or donate in certain areas, right? Based on having support with your board members. There's a lot you can do based on your in your area, right? And I cannot give you a specific one because it will be different from one person to another. Yes. Yes. If you're a person that is very very involved in social media, then that obviously is something that is important. Right. Well, don't ever undermine talking to people face to face. I'll tell you why. I'll tell you why. This is our experience, right? How many times have we received a text or read a post and we interpreted based on our mood? How many times? None of you guys, really? Am I the only one? Am I really the only one? Are you guys all not being honest with me over here? Right? Making me feel crazy? No. We all interpret it based on our mood, okay? This will not happen if the person is standing in front of you because you read their physical reaction, you read their facial, features. You see what's happening, right? I can say the same sentence in different ways and you'll interpret it based on my facial features and body behavior, right? Like, pass me the, I don't know, pass me a tissue, right? Pass me a tissue, right? This is in person. If I write that on a sentence, you will have to interpret based on you. So yes, social media has an impact, but never underestimate, right, the personal contact relations. In fact, sometimes that can cause an impact that you might not realize because the person influenced by you, right, will go ahead and influence other people. But sometimes when we influence media, yes, we achieve a broader sector, but we risk either understanding or misunderstanding. We also, when they receive that message, they're more unlikely to spread it as if you had that personal relation. I'm not disagreeing, Sheikh. Wallahi, I'm not disagreeing. That's not what I said. But don't underestimate the personal one that you do. We should not just not talk to other people personally and just be on the media. Personal relations as social being has an effect. We cannot deny that. Right? It's more powerful in terms of sustaining that connection. Right? I can tell you something over social media, you agree with it, but then you'll see the next post, you'll get mad, and that's it, disconnect, gone. But if I have a personal relation with you, if I say something you might not agree with, you're not going to sever that relation, you'll engage in conversation. Right? The impact is longer. Yeah, Sheikh, Wallah, I'm not disagreeing. Yeah, Sheikh, I'm not disagreeing. But what is the benefit if I sit all day, right? All day. My coworkers are there, okay? And all I'm doing is social media. Well, my coworkers, if I engage with them personally, they will also get on social media. That's what I'm talking about. Don't underestimate it. Wallah, I'm not denying this, Sheikh. We should. I'm not saying we don't. Right? Within what? Within protests, yeah. And we ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala that he gets fired very quickly. Say, I mean. طيب, Sheikh, once again, I'm not denying the effect of social media. Nobody's denying that, right? But we should not underestimate. I understand, right? I'm not saying we should not get on social media, right? Get on social media, but don't not engage with personal stuff. Hold on. Yes. Your fourth question? Down the list, you mean? Like you have a list of questions? No. Don't do that, right? So because the minute you do that, guess what's going to happen? Well, if you leave them and they vandalize, who looks bad? No. If you leave the pro-Israeli to vandalize, they look bad, right? And there's no way to spin this out. But the minute you engage in vandalism, guess what happens? You will look bad, and the media will spin it in one way or another. Okay? تفضل يا شيخ. So, chai is served. Just to let you know. Go ahead. So So once again, so I divided into different sections, right? So I said at the individual level, but also at the ummah level, as Muslims, we form task forces. I did mention that we need to form task forces. Organized task forces need to happen, so that would be extremely organized and direct what we want, right? Um, I'll give you an example, right? Uh, Different masajids can unite and release a united, for example, letter, right? That's one way to do it. I know for sure that there was a letter sent out for the imams to read and sign. It came to anybody who's a religious director or an imam. It came to them, and we all signed it, and that is being sent to the different governors, senators, and so there's different task forces happening. That's what should happen, right? As I mentioned, individual level is within your sphere, but then at the Muslim community level, there needs to be organized task forces. Yes, Sasha. So, so organization among them, you mean? Yes. So okay. So just there is an aspect of practicality over here, right? So yes, but you have to realize most people don't want to be on chats that they get 100,000 messages a day from one chat group, right? So practicality, that doesn't work, but there are other methodologies to do that. So for example, the Rutgers encampment, okay? There's a reason there's thousands all of a sudden there, right? Because each of those groups are in a network that somebody who's a network with a great network, they sent the message to the different messages or people on the board, and they connected with the other individuals. So there is some sort of a system. It's not as solid as we'd like it, as organized as we'd like it, but this is something, inshallah, hopefully we can learn from and change, right? We are a growing community, and with growing community, there's lessons that need to be learned, right? And changes need to happen, right? And an environment sometimes dictates and directs us, give us some sort of like a wake-up call sometimes of what we need to do. Perhaps, inshallah, we can capitalize on what is happening, right? I agree with you. The hopes is the idea or the idealistic situation is that there is like a hub, right? A connection. Like all the messages are connected one way or another, right? There's like a greater umbrella where all the messages fall underneath, right? It's a beautiful idea, right? And we should strive to it, but the mechanism of reaching to it is not as simple as we think, because different masajids have different opinions, different people have different inclinations, and it's just a matter of trying to get through all of that to achieve this, right? Now, part of the problem, so this is, I'll tell you something. This is easier in Muslim countries for a reason. Because in Muslim countries, you'd have a single organization, whether it's the government, whatever the case is, that will coordinate all this. So there's a higher, entity or governing body in control. We don't have that here, right? We need to form that body of government, but it will require a lot of effort, a lot of discussion to form that. Some states successfully did it, right? So I know, for example, in Texas, they have like an umbrella and all masajid, they even give donations into it and all these things, and there's board meetings across from members of different masajids. They to organize it. It is successful, mashallah. Many of the masajid join it, but some of the masajid haven't joined it yet. So there is a model. Once again, we can work towards it. But at the moment, we can work, we should work with what we have in the best way possible. Hold on. Yes. Just give me a second, Sheikh. What do you need? Yes. Yeah, no, there is. It's not as so I said there is. So there is, right? Alhamdulillah, there is, and it's forming. It's not as solid and perfect as we'd like it, but it's coming together, inshallah. It's not my fault, ya Sheikh. Wallah, it's not my fault. So I'm reminding you again, chai is at the back. They're not leaving, it's not my fault. Go ahead. So at the individual level, when you're discussing how can you maintain your emotions and be factual, right? So the factual part is based on the knowledge that you have. So it's very important for whatever topic that we discuss with individuals, we have to make sure that we have the sufficient background, did sufficient research to have, like, in our mind talking points, but also there is always, like, rebuttals that we should know ahead of time that we need to address. Now, keeping your emotions in check is the difficult part, right? Because anytime your opponent feels that they are being defeated intellectually, guess what they're going to resort to? Right? They're going to resort to doing things that would agitate you, right? Get you off your game. They will, like, start arguing things that have nothing to do with what we're discussing, right? They'll start pressuring you to, like, are you supporting Hamas, right? Is that what you're saying? You're supporting terrorists, right? You have to be able to know how to kind of maneuver that and essentially, like, bringing it back to the topic or responding in a way that would make him look bad or whatever the case is, right? But this is, like, you have to understand this is what they're doing. The minute they're going to try to do that, they already lost, right? Just don't kind of control as much as you can. Realize, like, I think one of the things that helps is realizing that they're losing. So it will make you feel better, right? Don't take it personally. They'll try to attack you personally. Just don't take it personally. Similar how the Prophet ﷺ never allowed the attack of the people of Quraysh, never allowed their attack on him to be personal. He didn't take it personally, even though they were attacking him, and he just continued. A beautiful example of Musa alayhi salam when he was talking to Fir'aun, when he was calling to Fir'aun to Islam, right? Fir'aun would go right and left and look at this person who can't even speak, right? Like, what is he calling? Is he, like, calling us to worship, like, the one God? There is no other people. Do you know? Like, Fir'aun was all over the place. And Musa kept focused to the point that in the end, Fir'aun could only resort to threatening him, right? If you take another Lord other than me, I'm going to kill you, right? That's it. And then Musa said, well, what if I show you a sign of a proof? So he said, show me, right? And so this is when he showed him the miracles. So just kind of, like, keep focused on it as much as you can. If you feel ever that you're losing your emotions, then perhaps, try to pause a little bit, calm down, or tell them a statement. You're obviously not here to have a productive conversation. It seems like you're mad and upset. Let's discuss some other time. So kind of deflect it on them. Wallah. What's the second question? Say it again. Can a dua be a form of? Well, nothing in this, that's our greatest weapon, right? That is our greatest weapon. Dua is our greatest weapon. Whether to make dua for people that can change their hearts or to allow us to speak well, all these things. So obviously this is a tool that we need to utilize. But that's the least that we should be doing, right? That is the least. So it is a form of activism, but it's the least we should be doing. Hold on. Type. Any more questions? No, we're done? No. Yes. Request. Earlier. I think people still driving, Sheikh, back from work. I know, people still driving from work. Sometimes. 6:45. We will take it into account, inshallah. But usually between Maghrib and Isha is a good time. Like, there's enough time to do the talk. Not prolong it to make it okay. Leave some time for people to have more time and socialize at the back. We might try it on Sunday, do it earlier. some other program, not this program. We're going to start another program, inshallah. جزاكم الله خير. سبحانك اللهم وبحمدك أشهد أن لا إله إلا أنت أستغفرك وأتوب إليك. والسلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته.